Declaro abierta la sesión.
The 9,980th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is reports of the Secretary General on the Sudan and South Sudan. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of South Sudan to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following to participate in this meeting. Ms. Marta Ama Akia-Pobe, Assistant Secretary General for Africa in the Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations. Mr. George Agri Owino, Interim Chairperson of the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, and Mr. Muriti Mutiga, Program Director for Africa, International Crisis Group. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2025/504, the report of the Secretary General on the situation in South Sudan. I now give the floor to Ms. Marta Ama Akia-Pobe. You have the floor.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, thank you for the opportunity to brief on the situation in South Sudan as outlined in the Secretary General's report submitted to this Council. Since our last briefing to this Council, as emphasized in the report of the Secretary General, there has been a continued erosion of the gains previously made in the peace process, including of the trust and confidence built among the parties to the revitalized peace agreement. There has been an escalation of political and subnational violence and stagnation in the implementation of the peace agreement. Since March this year, military offensives, primarily involving the South Sudan's People Defense Force, against the Sudan People's Liberation Movement in opposition, and including aerial bombardments and ground operations, have continued. They have undermined Chapter 2 of the peace agreement and resulted in deaths, displacements, and destruction of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools. The international community, including the United Nations, African Union, and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, have repeatedly called for a cessation of hostilities, de-escalation, and return to dialogue. These calls, however, have not yielded any concrete response. Instead, a pattern of violations and unilateral actions persist and continues to undermine the ability of the Government of National Unity to implement the agreement. There is a concern that the current military posture and ongoing operations will spur more violence and exacerbate intercommunal conflict. If this trend continues, it will likely lead to a shift in conflict dynamics from subnational and community-based violence to a more complex landscape shaped by ethnic divisions involving signatory parties and other actors, including those from neighboring countries. The ongoing spread of mis- and disinformation on social media risks further inflaming political and intercommunal tensions. This would ultimately undermine the cohesion and peaceful coexistence that must form the very foundation of this young nation. Mr. President, the current security and political tensions, including the ongoing arrest and detention of opposition figures without due process, have hampered efforts to complete the outstanding transitional tasks, particularly security sector reform and the electoral and constitution-making processes. While government officials have publicly expressed their commitment to elections by December 2026, the parties must take steps to return to dialogue and make the necessary decisions to move the country forward. Declarations of commitment are not enough. They must be followed by concrete and constructive actions in both the letter and spirit of the peace agreement. The holding of elections requires specific steps to be undertaken in line with what was agreed by the parties to the agreement. In this regard, we urge the government to reconvene the Joint Task Force on Elections and Constitution Making, as reiterated by the AU Peace and Security Council in its communique following the 12 June meeting, in the interest of transparency and cooperation. We also note that President Salva Kiir has formed a high-level ad hoc committee on the implementation of the revitalized agreement, with some 31 appointees, to ensure implementation of key benchmarks, including elections across all chapters of the agreement except Chapter 2. We encourage all parties to engage in constructive dialogue and confidence-building measures to foster a more inclusive and collaborative process, including the SPLM-IO led by Riek Machar. Mr. President, we welcome the commencement of the reconstituted Transitional National Legislative Assembly session on 16 July after a 6-month recess. The Council of Ministers, the Central Executive Forum tasked with driving implementation of the peace agreement, however, has yet to convene since March. This situation underscores the urgent need for the parties to re-engage through the institutional mechanisms and decision-making bodies established under the agreement. We call for the revival of multi-party government bodies and processes, which remain critical components of a pluralistic, functioning, power-sharing government. We commend the sustained engagement of civil society, particularly women and youth, who continue to advocate and to call for a return to the revitalized agreement. We take note of the recent adoption of the 5-year strategic plan of the judiciary of South Sudan that focuses on judicial independence, access to justice, accountability, and gender mainstreaming. While this is an important step forward, it is equally important to recall that it must be followed by the full range of actions necessary to achieve these goals. Similarly, the technical bodies of the electoral and constitution-making processes continue vital preparatory work with support from UNMISS and other partners, despite a lack of funding by the government. Mr. President, as we have consistently emphasized before this Council, our role is not to impose external timelines or conditions. It is to assist the parties to the revitalized agreement in implementing the provisions of the agreement that they themselves reached by consensus. In this regard, UNMISS has continued to provide impartial, technical, and logistical support to the transitional government in the implementation of the key tasks under the peace agreement. We affirm the importance of resolving political differences through dialogue and preventing a return to large-scale conflict. We also emphasize the need for inclusive, credible, and representative governance within the unity government, both in structure and functioning. Mr. President, we welcome the efforts of the African Union and IGAD, including the recent visits of the African Union Peace and Security Council and IGAD's Executive Secretary to Juba. We look forward to these regional entities supporting the parties in redoubling efforts for the inclusive implementation of the peace agreement. The shared message of the AU, IGAD, and the UN, as well as the broader international community, is one and the same. We call on the parties to unblock the current political deadlock by fully recommitting to the cessation of hostilities agreement, releasing the political detainees, engaging in direct high-level dialogue, and implementing an inclusive peace process, particularly on key issues such as the transitional security arrangements, transitional justice, constitution making, and elections. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in South Sudan is alarming. Funding cuts are leaving millions without life-saving assistance. Halfway through 2025, the humanitarian needs and response plan is only 28.5% funded. Between April and July, some 7.7 million people faced high levels of acute food insecurity, including 83,000 at risk of catastrophic conditions. Access challenges are growing. The protection for civilians is worsening. Access incidents affecting humanitarian operations are nearly double those of 1 year ago. Violence against aid workers, poor infrastructure, and administrative obstacles continue to impede relief efforts. Meeting South Sudan's humanitarian and development needs are challenging, but achievable. Government leadership in natural resource management and stronger public financial management are vital. Better alignment of budgets and expenditures for essential services, including health, education, and humanitarian support, can reduce suffering, build resilience, and advance peace. Mr. President, South Sudan is at a turning point. The revitalized peace agreement remains the only viable framework to break the cycle of violence in South Sudan and advance the transition towards the country's first democratic elections, which the people have aspired for so long and which they deserve. We urge this Council to give its full support to the people of South Sudan. We hope that the Council will impress on all actors and stakeholders, including South Sudan's political leadership, the imperative of respecting both the letter and spirit of the peace agreement. They must act in good faith, refocus on the implementation of the agreement, and lay the groundwork for credible and peaceful elections in December 2026. Failing this, the risk of a relapse into widespread violence will only grow against the background of an already unstable region. It is therefore our shared responsibility to work in close coordination and synergy to help the South Sudanese parties to avoid such an outcome. The people of South Sudan are counting on us. Thank you.
Agradezco a la señora.
I thank Ms. Pobi for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. George Agri Owino.
Thank you, Excellency. Your Excellency, Ambassador Eloy Alfaro de Alba, President of the UN Security Council, distinguished members of the Council, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, I congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month. I would also like to thank you for inviting the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, RJMEC, to address this esteemed council. This is my first address to this esteemed council since I assumed office in March of 2025 as the interim chairperson of the RJMEC. The RJMEC is the official oversight body responsible for monitoring and evaluating the status of implementation of the 2018 Revitalized Agreement on the resolution of the conflict in the Republic of South Sudan, the R-axis, and it is mandated under Article 7.10 of the R-axis to submit status of implementation reports quarterly, followed by detailed briefings to, among other bodies, the United Nations Security Council. When RJMEC last briefed this August Council in February of 2025, my predecessor informed you that in spite of the slow pace of implementation of the R-axis, the permanent ceasefire was holding and efforts were underway to expedite the implementation of the outstanding critical election-related tasks. He also informed that the parties had agreed by consensus to extend the transitional period from 22nd February of 2025 to 22nd February of 2027, with elections scheduled for December of 2026. Mr. President, esteemed Council members, since then, however, I wish to inform the Council that the political and security situation in the Republic of South Sudan has substantially deteriorated. In March this year, shortly after commencement of the extended transitional period, what started as an administrative military deployment coordinated by the South Sudan People's Defense Forces and the Sudan People's Liberation Movement in opposition forces into the town of Nasser in Upper Nile State, turned into a disagreement which quickly escalated and resulted in armed clashes, which consequently displaced tens of thousands of civilians and killed many. On the 3rd and 4th of March, Arnawar militia allegedly affiliated the SPLM-IO, locally known as the White Army, attacked an SSPDF garrison in Nasser, overran it, killed many soldiers, and on the 7th of March, the garrison commanding officer, a general, was also killed. This incident triggered a serious political and security crisis, which was followed by the arrest and detention in Juba of several senior SPLM-IO political leaders, including national ministers and members of parliament, as well as the SPLA-IO chief of defense forces and other military commanders. In the days that followed, His Excellency Dr. Riek Machar Teni, the first vice president, a major peace partner under the Axis, was put under hot arrest, where he remains to date. The permanent ceasefire has since been severely violated repeatedly, with area bombardments of SPLM-IO occupied areas by the SSPDF, including cantonment areas and training centers. There have also been reported violent armed clashes between SSPDF and SPLM-IO, including with the affiliate groups and forces in different parts of the country. The Uganda People's Defense Force, UPDF, on bilateral arrangement also deployed into the country, a move contested by some parties to the Arab axis. Mr. President, taken together, the clashes, deployment of UPDF, house arrest of a first vice president, and detention of several senior SPLM-IO officials have created widespread fear, subsequently forcing many senior opposition figures into self-exile, including His Excellency Dr. Riek Machar and his deputy, the Right Honorable Onyet Nathaniel Pireno, who is the acting chair of the SPLM-IO and was recently dismissed from the position of First Deputy Speaker of the Transition National Legislative Assembly. This situation, coupled with numerous unilateral dismissals and appointments of officials at the national and state levels undertaken by the government in breach of the letter and spirit of the responsibility sharing arrangements under the Earth Axis, has rendered the implementation of the Earth Axis virtually untenable, requiring serious interventions. There is very little progress in terms of implementation of the critical pending tasks and preparations for the conduct of elections as scheduled for December 2026. Mr. President, the current situation and trajectory of the country, if not urgently addressed, risks to reverse all that has been gained and may lead to a collapse of the Earth Axis, which could return the country back to an armed conflict. RJMEC and its partners, the African Union Mission in South Sudan, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, and the United Nations Mission in South Sudan, UNMISS, have repeatedly called for constructive dialogue, de-escalation of tensions, address the issues of detainees, and return to full and inclusive implementation of the Earth Axis. This clarion call for peace has been repeated by the region, the continent, and international partners and friends of South Sudan since the outbreak of the crisis. However, all efforts in this regard have not yet yielded a breakthrough. Instead, the violations on the Earth Axis continue, resulting in disruptions of humanitarian activities, including health facilities, and increasing number of deaths and displacement of civilians. Already, an estimated more than 30,000 people are reported to have been displaced in Upper Nile State alone since March 2025. And the focus of heavy rain and flooding that is expected will worsen the situation. Furthermore, persistent inflation continues to diminish the value of the domestic currency, leading to heightened economic challenges for the population of South Sudan. Mr. President, distinguished council members, in view of the aforementioned, RJMEC recommends the following to this esteemed council. First, endorse the call by the IGAD Summit and the AU Peace and Security Council to the South Sudanese government to de-escalate tensions, address the issue of First Vice President and all other detainees, embrace dialogue, and return to full and inclusive implementation of the Earth Axis and adhere to its letter and spirit. Secondly, consider undertaking an urgent high-level diplomatic mission to Juba to assess the situation and directly engage the parties to the Earth Axis. Third, support the regional efforts towards assisting the parties to commence dialogue and expedite implementation of the critical pending tasks towards a permanent constitution making and the conduct of elections in a timely manner. Fourth, call upon the SSPDF and SPLM-IO commands to cease all hostilities and to urgently restore full adherence to the permanent ceasefire and transitional security arrangements and refrain from acts of violence. And finally, consider all possible measures to hold peace spoilers and all violators of the R-axis accountable. Mr. President, in conclusion, RJMA would like to thank Your Excellency for convening this United Nations Security Council session on South Sudan. We also commend the African Union Peace and Security Council, who recently visited Juba. I have also had the privilege of briefing the different regional heads of state and government, including with the chairperson of IGAD in Djibouti last week. And my assessment is that the region, continent, and the international community do not want to see South Sudan relapse into armed conflict again. RGMF would like to remind this August Council that the R-axis, in spite of all its challenges, has restored relative peace across the country with the numerous peace dividends since its signing in September 2018, and remains a blueprint for the building of a lasting peace and stability in the country. It will be tragic if the gains of the R-axis to date are lost beyond restoration. RGMF therefore appeals to this esteemed council to bring its leverage to bear in order to salvage the implementation of the revitalized peace agreement and to remain seized of the situation in South Sudan. I thank you, Your Excellency.
Agradezco al señor.
I thank Mr. Owino for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Muriti Mutiga.
La palabra.
You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm honored to address the Security Council today on behalf of the International Crisis Group. Our organization, now commemorating its 30th anniversary, is committed to the prevention, mitigation, and resolution of deadly conflict. It is in the spirit of this conflict mitigation mandate that I address you today. This is a perilous moment for South Sudan. The country is experiencing one of its worst humanitarian crises since gaining independence, aggravated by both internal unrest and regional instability. Approximately 9.3 million people are in dire need of assistance, with 7.7 million suffering from acute food insecurity. Sexual violence is rife. The United Nations mission in South Sudan, UNMISS, is working to prevent a return to civil war and to promote lasting peace. But two significant developments highlight the need for more urgent preventive diplomacy by regional and global partners. First, the 2018 peace accord, which brought an end to the previous civil war, appears to be collapsing. The terms of that settlement required President Salva Kiir to work in concord with his rival first Vice President Riek Machar and others to achieve a set of objectives, including unifying the security forces, forging a new constitution, and laying the ground for the country's first elections. That accord was effectively terminated when President Kiir placed the former vice president under house arrest on the 26th of March. Trust runs low among the chief belligerents in the last civil war, and also within the president's own camp amid an undeclared succession battle. Second, the devastating civil war in neighboring Sudan has radiated instability into its southern neighbor and much of the region. It has driven over 1.2 million people into South Sudan, further straining already limited resources and services. South Sudan has also lost most of its oil revenues as fighting has disrupted flows to Port Sudan and therefore its ability to reach global markets. A severe humanitarian funding shortfall threatens to cut off life-saving aid to millions of vulnerable individuals. Against this backdrop, the security situation has deteriorated sharply. The army, backed by Ugandan forces and allied militias, has sustained a military campaign against opposition strongholds in the Equatoria and Upper Nile regions of South Sudan since March. Human security suffers in other ways too. Many people struggle with climatic stresses. An estimated 95% of the population are vulnerable to climate shocks. These environmental pressures feed into South Sudan's ongoing humanitarian crisis. For all these reasons, the operating environment for UNMISS and humanitarian partners remains perilous. Mr. President, regional and global partners ought to take urgent action to collaborate effectively in addressing the situation in South Sudan. The immediate priority should be to prevent any escalation of violence. Member states with close ties to South Sudan, such as Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa, and Tanzania, should call for a pause in military actions to create an opportunity for dialogue between the government and opposition groups. The Security Council should complement and amplify these messages.
President Machar undermines the core principles of the 2018 peace agreement and is a serious obstacle to reconciliation. Meanwhile, persistent reshuffles have caused further destabilization, and government institutions are not operating as they should. The United Kingdom echoes the African Union's call for the immediate release of all political detainees, including the first Vice President. This is necessary for credible and inclusive dialogue. We also encourage renewed political engagement with regional efforts to advance peace in South Sudan. Thirdly, the United Kingdom remains deeply concerned by the ongoing acute humanitarian crisis in South Sudan, with over 7.7 million people facing severe food insecurity and a cholera outbreak that has claimed more than 1,400 lives. These conditions are being exacerbated by spillover from the conflict conflict in Sudan and by the effects of climate change. The situation in South Sudan is a clear example of the linkages between climate, peace, and security. We commend UNMISS for its tireless work in addressing these climate-related risks, as well as its broader efforts to enable the delivery of aid and protect civilians. In this respect, President, the United Kingdom calls on South Sudan's leadership to ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all civilians in need, irrespective of political affiliation or ethnicity. And with respect to broader efforts to build resilience and secure lasting peace, we also urge South Sudan's leadership to take meaningful steps to address the growing impacts of climate change as a key driver of fragility and instability. I thank you.
Agradezco a la...
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank ASG Poby and Interim Chairperson Owina for their briefings. I also listened carefully to the statement by the civil society representative. I welcome the participation of the Deputy Permanent Representative of South Sudan in today's meeting. President, the peace progress, the security situation, and the economic and humanitarian situation in South Sudan still face some risks and challenges. The international community should increase its support and work together to help the country overcome its difficulties. In the light of the SG's report, I'd like to make the following points. First, it is imperative to advance the political transition in an orderly manner. South Sudan is the youngest country in the world, and its political process is not going to be completed overnight. China welcomes President Kiir's reaffirmation of his pledge not to return the country to war, and the recent process made by the government of South Sudan in preparing for the general elections, and encourages it to keep this positive momentum. We have noted that the signatories to the revitalized peace agreement have repeatedly emphasized their commitment to upholding the agreement and call on all political factions to bridge the differences through dialogue, accelerate the implementation of the arrangements under the agreement, and stay committed to a political settlement as the only path to peace. In response to the current difficulties, UNMISS, the AU, and IGAD are actively engaged in mediation. China welcomes the successive visits to South Sudan by the chairperson of the AU Commission, the Executive Secretary of IGAD, and the AU Peace and Security Council. The international community should maintain the necessary tolerance and patience, support regional mediation efforts, and support solving African issues in the African way. In particular, all parties should respect the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of South Sudan and refrain from illegal and undue interference or pressure. Second, maintaining peace and stability in the country is a top priority. The unstable security situation in Upper Nile state, among others, is concerning. China calls on all parties in South Sudan to exercise calm and restraint, cease hostilities, and avoid any spillover of conflict to civilians and civilian facilities. We encourage the government of South Sudan, with the support of UNMISS, to continue to take positive steps to reduce intercommunal violence and promote peace and reconciliation. At the same time, it should speed up the deployment the necessary unified forces and better fulfill its primary responsibility to protect civilians. As the conflict in the Sudan drags on and continues to spill over, the cross-border movement of armed personnel and the illicit proliferation and circulation of small arms and light weapons are becoming ever more prominent. The international community should support South Sudan in enhancing border control and security capacity building. The AU Peace and Security Council have issued multiple communiques calling for the lifting of the arms embargo on South Sudan. Members in the region have also put forward feasible phased proposals. This council should listen in earnest to the strong appeals of the countries concerned and African countries in general and adjust or lift the unreasonable sanctions at an early date. Third, the fundamental solution is to address the economic and livelihood difficulties at present. South Sudan is suffering from high inflation and a weak economy due to the rainy season, floods, epidemics, and food insecurity, among others, continue to worsen. And the number of displaced persons continues to rise, exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. In the short term, UN agencies should strengthen coordination with the government of South Sudan, improve the forward-looking and targeted nature of their humanitarian operations to ensure that assistance reaches those in need in a timely manner. In the long term, the international community should increase financial and technical support, among others, to help the country achieve economic diversification and sustainable development, so as to address at the root the shortcomings of a single industrial structure and the lack of internal driving force for growth, and to strengthen the foundations of peace through development. Since the beginning of this year, China has supported the resumption of oil production and transportation in South Sudan and provided multiple batches of food and supplies assistance to the affected populations in eastern Equatorial State and other places, thereby effectively alleviating the humanitarian situation on the ground. China continued to support South Sudan in improving its economy and people's livelihood to the best of its ability. President, China welcomes the good mutual trust and cooperation between UNMISS and the government of South Sudan and appreciates the great deal of effective work by UNMISS under the leadership of SRSG Haysam, despite the difficult situation. As a major troop contributing country to UNMISS, China will, as always, support the mission in discharging its mandate. China is ready to continue to work with the international community to play a constructive role in the realization of peace and stability, development, and prosperity in South Sudan at an early date. Thank you, President.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, first of all, I'd like to thank the Assistant Secretary General for Africa, Martha Pobi, for her comments, and also Major General George Owino and Mr. Muriti Mutiga for their briefings. As we've just heard, the situation in South Sudan remains very precarious because of an accumulation of internal and external factors. And I'd like to highlight 4 points. Firstly, the peace agreement remains the only political framework providing prosperity for the peaceful development of the country. All measures counter to the revitalized agreement purely serve to whip up tensions. We take note here of the repeated calls of the African Union for a cessation of hostilities and the release of the first Vice President, Riek Machar. And we echo those. France takes note of the efforts of the South Sudanese transition government in modernizing its financial system and that of its administration. Most important progress in implementing the revitalized agreement, however, have not yet been achieved. The deployment of the unified forces, which is necessary as a priority, as is the drafting of a constitution. The aim remains to prepare for free, fair, and transparent elections that would enable the promised political transition for the South Sudanese people. Secondly, France calls for the full respect of the arms embargo renewed by this Council in May. South Sudan is in a region affected by a number of crises that exacerbate its own security situation, in particular the conflict in neighboring Sudan. France calls upon all states to act in line with the aims of the revitalized agreement and refrain from all actions that could cause tensions in the country or fuel fighting in Sudan from South Sudan. Mr. President, thirdly, France would reiterate its support for the UN mission in South Sudan and the special representative of the the Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Nicholas Haysom. Barriers to freedom of movement of its troops are increasing in number in violation of the SOFA and harm the implementation of its mandate. All South Sudanese stakeholders must cooperate with UNMISS, which plays a key role for the stability of the country and of its people. Finally, the international community must continue its support for the population of South Sudan. They are dealing with forced displacement, violence, floods, food insecurity, and epidemics. France condemns the repeated attacks against humanitarian personnel. They must be protected in line with international humanitarian law. Safe and unhindered humanitarian access to people in need must be guaranteed. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me also thank the briefers for their insightful interventions. I also welcome the representative of South Sudan to the chamber. South Sudan's potential relapse into large-scale conflict remains a significant concern. The ongoing violence targeting civilians coupled with the threat of escalation is deeply alarming, particularly in the context of severe and widespread acute food insecurity and a deadly cholera outbreak. Denmark urges all parties to prioritize the well-being of the South Sudanese and calls for an immediate cessation of all hostilities. We commend the diplomatic efforts of regional organizations, including the AU, PSC, and IGAD's recent visit to Juba. We strongly encourage full engagement by the authorities in South Sudan with these initiatives. Mr. President, I will focus on 3 points. First, the 2018 peace agreement remains the most viable pathways to sustainable peace. It's imperative that all parties, both in government and opposition, reaffirm their commitment to its full implementation. We strongly urge President Kiir to unconditionally reverse his decision and to release First Vice President Riek Machar. His detention without due process is detrimental to dialogue and reconciliation efforts and undermines the prospects for peace. The international community must be allowed to communicate with the First Vice President. Furthermore, Denmark calls for renewed and inclusive mediation efforts, which include civil society representatives, women and youth, among others. The people of South Sudan deserve to have agency and a clear voice in shaping the peaceful future of their country. Second, UNMISS remains a cornerstone of peace and stability efforts, especially in supporting the implementation of the peace agreement. We commend its ongoing commitment, especially in its work to protect civilians and its support for civil society organizations. We call on all parties to fully cooperate with UNMISS so it can carry out the tasks assigned by this Council. We also support UNMISS's efforts in facilitating dialogue between communities, given the significant presence of intercommunal violence. As highlighted in the stakeout by the joint pledge holders on climate, peace and security ahead of this meeting, the adverse effects of climate change, including extreme flooding, are triggering significant displacement and conflicts over land and resources. Denmark remains committed to supporting the continued integration of climate, peace, security considerations into the missions operations in alignment with its mandate. We support UNMISS's monitoring of human rights violations. We are alarmed by the sharp increase in violations, included conflict-related sexual violations, which have reached the highest number in a single quarter since 2020. We reiterate our call for holding the perpetrators accountable and recall the obligation for all actors to comply with international humanitarian law and human rights law. The transitional justice institution envisaged for South Sudan, including the hybrid court, must be established and must become operational to prosecute those bearing the greatest responsibility for atrocities. Third, the latest IPC report reveals that over half the population, 7.7 million people, face acute food insecurity. Reductions in humanitarian funding are having a devastating impact, undermining efforts to meet urgent needs. At the same time, persistent insecurity and conflicts continue to severely restrict humanitarian access, especially in opposition-held areas. In South Sudan and across the world, we condemn the targeting and killing of humanitarian personnel and demand full accountability for such attacks. Mr. President, the ongoing conflict in neighboring Sudan continues to drive thousands of people across borders in search of safety, placing additional strain on South Sudan. We remain deeply concerned about the negative interlinkages between violent conflict in the two countries and their possible ramifications should be monitored closely. In conclusion, Denmark reiterates its commitment to supporting UNMISS and the people of South Sudan and their strive to secure a future anchored in peace, stability, and sustainable development. We call on all stakeholders, local, national, and regional, to redouble their efforts in support of a peaceful transition. Thank you.
Agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful to Assistant Secretary General Ms. Marta Pobe and the representative of the interim chairperson of the Reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, Mr. George Awinau, and we listened to Mr. Muriti Mutiga. As well, we welcome today's meeting the representative of South Sudan. The situation in South Sudan is not quite stabilized. The clashes between the government forces and the opposition are leading to casualties, including civilian casualties. It is also worrisome that the ethnic component is at the basis of the current exacerbation of tensions. The tensions in South Sudan are creating grounds for large-scale destabilization in neighboring countries. We are seriously concerned by reports about possible use of South Sudanese
remains seriously underfinanced as a result of the increasingly limited capacity of resources. In addition to this, the country is facing many unprecedented climate risks. Recent floods have affected millions of people, while recurrent droughts and environmental degradation are only intensifying food insecurity and intercommunal conflicts over resources such as land and water. Against this backdrop, Panama stresses the need to strengthen regional cooperation to implement early warning systems to promote climate resilience and to link peace building with strategies for sustainable adaptation. Unwavering respect for human rights is a fundamental principle. It is non-negotiable, and it must be part of any national and international response. We are concerned by reports that allege the persistence of extrajudicial executions, attacks on humanitarian and educational facilities, widespread displacement, sexual violence against women and girls, and recent restrictions of the civic space. These abuses do not just undermine the commitments of South Sudan under international law, but they also weaken the possibilities for sustainable peace. We reiterate the urgent call to the government of South Sudan and all armed actors to respect international humanitarian law, to guarantee unhindered humanitarian access, and immediately to cease any kind of violence against civilians. Panama acknowledges and welcomes regional efforts to stabilize the situation. We in particular welcome the recent visit to Juba, headed up by the chair of the African Union Commission and accompanied by representatives of the international of IGAD. The sustained attention of the African Union Peace and Security Council as well as the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission are essential contributions to maintain the channels of dialogue and monitoring open so as to avoid any further fragmentation of the peace process and of the country as a whole. We believe that this regional commitment needs to remain robust, and it must be guided by the principles of the revitalized agreement, and all measures need to contribute to strengthening multilateral efforts to achieve peace. On the political process, Panama underscores the need to ensure safe, free, inclusive, and credible elections. There can't be a legitimate process if there are still restrictions on fundamental freedoms, if the participation of women-led organizations is limited, as well as those led by young people and community leaders, and if they are excluded from the decision-making arena. Inclusion and broad dialogue are essential conditions for any kind of lasting democratic transition. UNMISS also has an important role to play in all of this process. Its support to local actors in civil society, particularly the grassroots organizations, strengthens the community social fabric. Its work in protecting civilians and supporting constitutional processes must continue to have the support of this Council. Your Excellencies, South Sudan is facing many different political, humanitarian, and climate challenges. Nevertheless, there are still windows of opportunity. With political determination, robust international commitment, and respect for human rights, peace can be achieved. Panama reiterates its solidarity with the people of South Sudan in their quest for dignity, safety, and justice, and we reaffirm our belief that only through an inclusive process based on the rule of law and respect for human rights can the so yearned for peace be achieved. I resume my functions as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of South Sudan.
Mr. President, Excellencies, at the onset, allow me to congratulate Panama for the presidency of the UN Security Council for the month of August. I commend your leadership in that regard. I also acknowledge the briefers for their statements and wish to affirm that their observations and comments are well taken notice of. Mr. President, South Sudan takes note of this Security Council briefing on the situation in our country and the Secretary General's 90-day report. We would like to emphasize that we remain committed to peace, stability, and cooperation with the international community. To demonstrate that, we would like to state the following points. First, South Sudan values its partnership with the United Nations and reaffirms its readiness to continue cooperating with UNMISS to advance the peace, stability, and development in our country. In doing so, we expect that the mission will remain neutral and impartial in its reporting and activities, ensuring that all accounts reflect the full picture, including positive developments and progress made.
you.